Okay, now let's get on to the course topic for today, which is food and evolution. There have been major changes, of course, in the food supply. It's happened over the course of, millions of years of human evolution, but it's happened also in a relatively recent time frame when we think about the American diet and what people are eating, but also the world diet, of course. Here's a picture of a cover from the journal or the magazine The Economist, who were writing about food and nutrition in modern times, and they created this graphic for the website to show the evolution of humans. And so they show these as some of the first stages, and then intermediate stages they depict it as this, and then the final one is this. So notice the large beverage in this fellow's left hand. So this is a really pretty dramatic change in human evolution, and the question is, what happened? What made things go so awry that people and food used to be more in sync in terms of health and well-being, although there were problems in some ways? Why did this happen, and then what's the impact? What is all this doing to us? Now, several lectures down the road we'll talk about modern food and epidemiology. That is, what is the research on food intake and human health? And what do we know about our health and well-being based on diets? But let's talk about more ancient societies and how food got started and what sort of phases we've gone through and how does that shape what's going on today. If you look at the percent of time people in society were involved in various activities and broke it into agriculture versus everything else, in ancient Egypt it looked like this. So basically, the whole society was spending all of the time raising enough food just to support life. And there was only 5% left over, and that ended up being used in ways like this. So obviously, with this sort of partitioning of behavior and activities and effort, there's not a lot of time left over for leisure, for development of new technologies and things like this. So agriculture pretty much overwhelmed everything else. And if you think about what ancient food gathering habits used to be like, you see things like this, where people are out gathering food that is growing naturally. And you can think about what sort of conditions this would create and what kind of hardships it would create. Well, first, you're subject to the food not growing. If there are droughts, pests, other things that interfere with the growing of the food, you've got problems. And that made some populations mobile because they had to move from place to place to find food, but of course it made starvation a very real possibility. In different parts of the world, you would see this sort of activity for finding food. But again, the elements were harsh. Finding food may not have been easy, and certain sorts of diets would prevail over others, where there would be a lot of certain nutrients and few of other ones, and humans suffered as a consequence from nutritional deficiencies in almost all parts of the world because there weren't complete diets. And then you see way back in human histories figures like this, where people had to go hunt for their food, and of course there was danger involved in this, uncertainty of the food supply and the like. So this is all pretty well known. So this is captured in this little quote by Woody Allen. And we get to modern conditions where we see something like this. Now here we have a situation where you have a completely concocted food. You have something like Twinkies to begin with, not something found in nature. And then we concoct them even further by deep frying them and then having them with a sugared beverage. And that's certainly different than ancient times. And we see what the environment has become. And here you see something where there's deep fried Twinkies, deep fried candy bars, deep fried onions, and deep fried Coca-Cola. Has anybody ever had deep fried Coke? How is it?
It tasted like Coke with a lot of oil.
It tasted like Coke with a lot of oil. Yeah, because it's like fried dough, isn't it? They make it like that, but instead of water or whatever, they put Coca-Cola into it. Interesting. Okay, so one brave soul admitted to having fried Coke. Thank you for doing that. But there's a lot of frying going on at this particular place. And this is something that's not typical of ancestral human diets. And so if you think about the modern food environment compared to the ancient one, so let's say somebody getting something at a fair, compared to the old days, well, how do these two humans differ in their relationship to food? And what type of different foods were they eating and how much effort went into getting them? So here you have somebody who's happy, at ease, and completely secure that there will be food around the corner. There's never any question at all about whether one can eat. Now, it could be that you're hungry, but you're working hard, and so you may not get your food for an hour until after you're hungry. There may be a little bit of uncertainty about that. There may be a little uncertainty about whether the pizza place is still going to be open late at night when you will get hungry. There may be uncertainties of that nature, but certainly not the uncertainties of early humans. And so you have somebody like this who would be frightened to death about getting the food. And you have somebody over here who has a completely different relationship with it. And what does that mean? Does it change how humans appreciate food, what it does to their relationship with food, and of course, what it does to their health and well-being? So things have changed a lot. And you also have to factor in here how much physical work is involved in getting the food. So on the left, you see somebody expending enormous physical effort to secure the food. Here are humans who had to walk long distances potentially to find the food, kill the food at great risk to themselves, inspiring a cascade of physiological effects that have to do with fear and arousal and things like that, not to mention all the calories one would burn doing this kind of activity. And then there would be the butchering of the animal, there would be the securing the crops from the fields and then bringing it to wherever you were going to eat it, which burns more calories and requires more physical effort compared to the person on the right that really doesn't have to do much at all. So this shows part of the changed relationship with food. Now, if any of you are interested in exploring this issue of food and history, there's an awful lot written about it. A number of books that have been written about it that are quite good. One that I found most instructive is called The Cambridge World History of Food, which is this two very large volumes, edited volumes with a number of smaller chapters in them on food and history, and they're really very good. I'm not sure if the Yale Library has this or not, but if they don't, you could ask the librarian to get it. But it's an excellent resource that talks a lot about the history of food. So some of the things that I'm about to talk about are drawn from chapters in that particular volume. Now we'll go back further than 10,000 years to talk about the history of food. But at 10,000 years ago, several very important changes happened that have shaped to a great extent what our modern relationship with food is. And that was the planful growing of food and the domestication of animals. So we'll loop back to this in just a moment, but start by going back earlier in history. So this Cambridge History of Food talks about three separate primary phases in human food evolution. One beginning 1.5 million years ago, another about 700,000 years ago, and then the 10,000 year ago one that I talked about just a moment ago. So phase one, 1.5 million years ago, in the late Miocene and early Pleistocene phases, there was a shift where people were less likely to be just going out and gathering foods from every place they could find it, to some planting of food, although not a lot, but also dealing with food in different ways. Instead of just eating it at the time, there would be processing of it. There would be some sort of cooking, some attempt to store food for when people may have been hungry later, etc. And then going from a plant-based diet to a diet that included meat. Now these were important changes because humans, of course, are omnivores and can eat both plants and animals, and therefore the ability to secure nutrients from these different sources became very appealing to humans. Phase two in the middle Pleistocene phase 700,000 years ago. Then we got into more deliberate hunting of animals. Larger species were hunted. And then you started to see humans eating things like mammoth deer, horse, bison, and reindeer. And humans banded together instead of working more as individuals and started hunting animals in groups. Groups of animals hunted by groups of humans. And the plant diet at this point was still quite important. Then the phase 3 that I mentioned, the 10,000 years ago, had several things occur that were very important in shaping our current situation. So we have modern patterns of climate, vegetation, and fauna. So the climate conditions were somewhat similar to today. Several large animal species had disappeared, so people had to find other animals, and so this changed from going to find animals to domesticating animals, and shift from collection of plants to production of plants. So because of the climate and because of certain things growing in different parts of the world, and by the way, I see some of you kind of struggling to keep up with some of the things I'm doing in the slides, but I'm hoping to make broad points here, and again, the slides will be posted on the website, so don't worry so much if you're not able to get everything down. So in certain locations, things were dominated by certain cereals. Rice in Asia, wheat in Europe, sorghum and millet in Africa, and maize in the New World. And these then became the objects of trade, of commerce, and of course of human diets. And these had nutritional implications for people in different parts of the world. And so the people who write about food history have called these things superfoods, not necessarily because they're super rich in all nutrients, but because they were super available. The ubiquity, not the nutrition, was what got them called superfoods. But they became dominant foods in different parts of the world. And so you can see in the New World, with maize being important, how America has become a corn-dominated society. Even though it's still true that we raise wheat, we raise other things in the United States, and we can import different foods, corn has become an incredibly important constituent of the diet in the U.S. And later in the course, we'll talk about how much of your body has been influenced by corn, how much of your diet is influenced by corn, how many products you touch in a given day have been derived in some way from corn, and it's really quite amazing. That would not necessarily be true in other parts of the world, but it is true in this part of the world. Now, the fact that people were so reliant on certain foods led to deficiencies of certain nutrients. So people that were dependent on a rice-based diet tended to have problems with deficiencies in protein, vitamin A, and thiamine. Now, again, this is the kind of detail I'm not expecting you to remember, but it's just an exemplar of this broader issue about how dependence on certain foods leads to nutritional deficiencies. They have to get remedied somehow, or else people have health problems. And so either people in these populations were malnourished, or they had to find supplementation for these superfoods in order to survive. This is an interesting quote about maize from this particular book called Prehistoric Food Production in North America. And if you have trouble reading it, I'll read it. By the time of Columbus, maize had already become the staff of life in the New World. It was distributed throughout both hemispheres, from Argentina and Chile, northwest to Canada, and from sea level to high in the Andes, from swampland to arid conditions, and from short to long day lengths. And becoming so widespread, it evolved hundreds of races, or types of corn, each with special adaptations for the environment, including special utilities for man. Now, there a lot is hidden in this, this particular quote. Number one is because corn was or maize was so important during this period of time, but it was grown in many, many different conditions: high altitude, low altitude, short days, long days. Hundreds of species of maize developed, and that led to great biodiversity. And that meant that people growing corn were less vulnerable to having things wipe out entire crops. because there were different types of crops planted around the world. So the world corn supply would never be threatened by anything. But as we'll talk about later in the class, the biodiversity has shrunk. So what used to be hundreds of varieties of corn is now just a few. As I'll explain later in class, in Florida, there used to be many, many, many varieties of oranges, and now there are about 4. And there are commercial reasons for this occurring, but the biodiversity has shrunk for various reasons of profitability, and as a consequence of that, things like corn crops and the orange crop in Florida are particularly susceptible to certain environmental conditions, certain pests, and certain types of blight. Because of that, large amounts of particular types of pesticides and fertilizers and the like have to be used to defend against these outside threats, and those bring their own series of environmental consequences. So we'll go into that in some detail. But it's interesting how humans and plants have evolved together. And there's a very interesting book on this by Michael Pollan called The Botany of Desire. Now we're reading another book for the class by Michael Pollan, not this particular one. But this book is a pretty quick read, and it's extremely interesting. And his premise in this book is that humans have become dependent on plants and animals have become evolutionarily dependent on humans at the same time. And so this idea that the human body has evolved to be able to take in certain sorts of foods, and that the foods have evolved at the same time and they become dependent on one another is an extremely interesting premise, and Pollan writes beautifully. So this is an interesting book worth exploring, and I'd urge you to read it if you get the opportunity. So this idea that humans have evolved, that physical changes have occurred in humans as a consequence of their food environment has led us to where we are now. And I alluded to this a little bit in the first class about how humans have evolved to seek out energy because famine was the largest threat, is one example of this. Now there are challenges to a plant-based diet, which made eating meat important to humans in human history. Some of the challenges that you see here I mentioned before. So there's problems with drought, with pests, with temperature changes and the like. There were also issues about nutritional adequacy, and meat turned out to be a better overall food than most plants. Now that seems counterintuitive now because we think that a plant-based diet may be more healthy for people than a meat-based diet, but remember that we're fighting off overnutrition, and these folks were fighting off undernutrition. The plants can be deficient in certain things, especially fat-soluble vitamins that come from meat and from essential amino acids. And so in order to have a completely balanced diet that's completely plant-based, one has to be very careful about having a wide array of foods. And a narrower array of foods is necessary for nutritional adequacy if people are eating meat. Now that's not to say that this has implications for what people are eating now, but it certainly did at one point. There are changes in food and agriculture that made a number of things possible. Once it became true that people could raise food or gather food or produce food for more than just themselves or their families, meant that people were free to do other things. Not everybody had to be involved in creating food. And so that gave people more time to trade, to develop other products, to be involved in non-food pursuits and many, many more things. So it was a major change in human evolution where people started raising animals in large groups or started growing plants in large amounts. And there were some landmarks along the way. So the plant-based economies began in the Middle East and then they spread to the rest of the world. This was thought by many to be a positive change, but in game-rich environments where there was a lot of meat available, people could actually get many more calories per hour, that is, secure more food that would help fend off starvation compared to what they could get for people cultivating food. So economically, it made more sense to eat meat under those circumstances. But of course, the meat didn't exist in all places of the world, so some people were dependent on plants. And so change comes from necessity. People have to evolve to have a biology that tolerates the subsistence that they have access to, and that varies in different parts of the world. So again, humans evolve. And so this quote from Larson in the Cambridge World History of Food captures this. Virtually every major anatomical change, think about that for a minute, every major anatomical change that has existed in humans can be related in one way or another to how foods are acquired and processed by the human body. Quite a remarkable statement. And I was reminded of this when I saw this cartoon. So there's an anatomical change for you. But things, of course, have changed since those early times in so many ways. And if you go back to this particular graphic, the interesting thing is how have humans changed and what are they like now? Well, now the food environment is things like this. And so instead of hard labor to go get food, all it requires is a little drive-in to the window. And, you know, it used to be the case, I forget how long drive-in windows have been around, certainly as long as you guys can remember, but there was a time when drive-in windows didn't exist. And when that was the case, if you wanted fast food, you had to at least spend the calories to get out of your car to walk into the place to buy the fast food. And now you're saving a few calories because you don't even have to do that. So the food environment's changed in a lot of ways. People even get coached on how to do it. So when drive-in windows were introduced recently in Malaysia, these little graphics went out to show people how you actually use the drive-in window. McDonald's created these. So you drive your car in, it shows you by the arrows where you go. You stop at window 1 to make your order and pay, and then you go to window 2 to collect your food, and they're open 24 hours. So again, it shows how much things have changed during that period of time. And even if you're a moose, you can get fast food. Here's another example of that. So back to this graphic again. Unpredictable food supply occurred on the left, but doesn't occur on the right. Starvation was a major threat on the left, but not on the right. And the top priority on the left was to bank energy. The top priority on the right has become to spend energy. And so a completely different way humans are interacting with food.